Let me ask you guys, how many of you have heard the story in the last couple of weeks of Ted Williams? Yeah, several people, right? Because this video is totally going viral. What happened was there was this man, Ted, who was in Ohio. He was homeless. He lived in Cleveland or Columbus. I don't know if there's a difference. Just some city way out there in Ohio. Anyway, some Ohio place. And so he lived there, and he was homeless. But he has this incredible voice. And so his sign actually said, I have a voice given from God, and I just need some help. So a local reporter went and just shot some video of Ted and posted it on YouTube, and this thing totally went viral. So just check this out.
Around the water cooler, we love this story this morning. Talk about a man getting a second chance and using his voice to get that second chance. We've all seen homeless people, and usually they're at the freeway. Well, this man's name is Ted Williams, and a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch newspaper in Ohio, saw him holding this sign, and he was asking for help. And then this gentleman, Ted Williams, spoke, and it was no ordinary voice. Take a listen.
When you're listening to nothing but the best of oldies, you're listening to Magic 98.9. Thank you so much. God bless you. Thank you. And we'll be back with more right after these words.
He didn't want to give up the mic.
We'd
also learned that he used to work on the air, but had fallen on some hard times as well.
Right, that's right. Here's his story.
I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. When I was 14, I kind of listened to one of our area radio announcers. And I went as a field trip to go meet the guy, and he looked nothing like what he sounded like. So I asked him about that, and he said to me, listen, radio is defined theater of mind. And so when he said theater of mind, I just said, well, hey, I can't be an actor, I can't be an on-air personality, but the voice just became something of a development over years, and I went to school for it. And then alcohol and drugs and a few other things became a part of my life. And I got 2 years clean.
Yes.
Wow.
And the way he was admitting that he had those problems and came clean. And so he's been on the radio in Columbus, Ohio this morning, and the radio station could not offer him a job. But a lot of people have called in, and they've offered him some work.
I know, so compared himself to Job, but said that God had saved his life, and maybe he'll get that second chance out of a little bit of this.
So this video had such legs, such kind of viral movement to it that actually it's already outdated, the one you saw, because he already has a job. He's now the public address announcer for the Cleveland Cavaliers, the NBA team that's in Cleveland. So he has this incredible job now, all because of this viral video that went out. They just posted it on YouTube, and that was the whole story. And this viral concept is pretty common now in our world, whether it's the peanut butter and jelly song or whatever. Just something kind of starts and it just grows and kind of ripples outward. And I think that's a great way to kind of understand the perspective that we're going to take this morning on our text. We're studying the book of Genesis. Our readings this week took us from chapters 6 to 23. And Trevor mentioned it before. Our church together is reading through the Bible in a year. And so this is our first full week that we've had. So this morning, we're going to preach on a huge section of the Bible. That's why we have padded chairs and coffee, okay? Because there's a lot to cover here. But we're not going to take all of it. We're actually going to do chapters 6 to 11, because that's kind of a natural break in the Bible. The first 11 chapters are sort of the primeval history of man, where everything is just spreading virally. And we're going to really look at this spreading through 4 different threads in 2 different time periods. So if you're a note taker, this might be the day for you. 4 different threads of spread. We're going to look at the expanding of the human race, the darkening of human sin, the widening of God's punishment, with the deepening of God's grace. That all 4 of these elements were spreading throughout this period at a tremendous rate. The expanding of the human race, the darkening of human sin, the widening of God's punishment, and the deepening of God's grace. First, let's look at those 4 threads from the time of Adam, which we covered last week, up until the flood. Now, we're not going to really talk about the flood too much today, except just remember that's when the rains came down, and the floods came up, and the animals went in the ark 2 by 2, right? You know this. It's on the wall of most churches. I'm not sure why, because it's actually a horrific story of everyone dying. But we put it in the nursery so the kids can see the animals, I guess. But that's the flood, okay? So we're going to talk about from Adam up until the flood, okay? So in those 4 threads, first of all, the expanding of the human race. Adam was told to be fruitful and to multiply. Scholars tell us that by the time of the flood, there were probably at least 1 billion people on the face of the earth. in about 1,600 years. That might sound like it's really, really fast, which it is, but don't forget, this was that time in human history with incredibly long lifespan. The Bible records a number of people who lived more than 900 years, okay? I don't know if they had arthritis or what, but they lived 900 years plus. So if you live for 900 years, well, the population expands very quickly because there's not that many people leaving the earth. There's just a whole lot coming. So clearly man was expanding at an incredible rate. But unfortunately, in our second thread, so was the darkening of human sin. And we saw several examples of this darkening of sin throughout this period. It started, of course, with Adam and Eve, that the enemy really appealed to their sense of pride and self-worth to say, you too can be like God. You can know what he can know if you'll just choose your own way. And so they did. And following from there, Adam and Eve had 3 sons, 2 at first. One of them went even further from God's plan. And he said, I'm embarrassed, God, that you've chosen my brother's offering over mine, and I'm going to kill him. I'm going to murder out of jealousy. Human sin continues to expand. Then Lamech, who was a descendant of Cain, was also a murderer. And the text seems to indicate he was kind of proud of this, that he declared it to his wives. Yes, he had more than one wife. That, yes, I have murdered and I have injured. And he was kind of proud of that. In fact, the Bible seems to indicate that Lamech is almost the living embodiment and the example of sin. And the Bible also mentions this other group of people called the sons of God, who've intermarried with the daughters of men in a way that really displeased God. Now, who are the sons of God? I know we're moving quickly, but I don't want to skip this. The sons of God is a fascinating question and discussion, which a lot of people have asked me about, and so we're just going to kind of break out. There's really a couple of most prevalent theories on who the sons of God actually were. And I'll just give them both to you, and from there you can do your own Wikipedia-ing and all of that and figure out what you think, okay? Really, the first one is mankind. Adam and Eve had 3 sons. One of them killed another, so there's 2 sons remaining. So you have the Cain line. Cain was the murderer. And you have the Seth line, the son who was born to replace the good son who had died. And the whole world could be divided into these 2 camps at that time, those that came from Cain, those that came from Seth. So some people believe it's talking about the sons of God must be the descendants of Seth, those who honored God, those who had a righteous lineage, that the daughters of men must be the women of the Cain line, and that this intermarrying must have been between these 2 lines of Adam, which would have displeased God because the righteous were taking wives from the unrighteous. So many people believe that this was the intermarrying that offended God, that he was not happy with, that he considered to be sinful. Some people take it from a little different approach. They feel like to refer to only some of creation as the sons of God is a little bit inconsistent because all men are created in the image of God. And then to refer to the daughters of men as only being half, again, is a little bit confusing. And it doesn't explain why they're called the Nephilim, and they seem to physically be different from other people on the face of the earth. In fact, these Nephilim became men of renown, which is more like infamy. They were likely known for heinous acts and for terrible things. Heroes isn't the best way to kind of think of them. So many people believe that these sons of God must have been angels who used to be in heaven but were cast out of heaven because of a sinful act, and they were on the earth. And that these sinful angels must have taken human wives. I know this sounds wild, but church fathers have actually thought this for 2,000 years. And a lot of people believe that the sons of God and the daughters of men is actually the marrying of fallen angels and human women, and that is why we needed the flood to wipe out this emerging race of people. Those are 2 different theories on the Nephilim and the sons of God. But one thing that's clear, the intermarrying that was happening was very displeasing to God. And he considered it to be a darkening of their sin. Because of that, we see in our third thread, again, the widening of God's punishment. Adam and Eve, they were expelled from the garden, and they were sent east, so that they would be outside of God's presence in the garden, and they were told to farm, to work the ground. Then when Cain was cast out of the family unit, God told him, you no longer can farm. The ground won't yield for you. You're going to have to wander the earth. You're going to have to forage and beg and hunt because the ground will not yield for you anymore. You can't have it. Then in the time of Lamech, that's when God said, you know what, I'm going to shorten the lifespan of the time that man will be on this earth to 120 years. And we see lifespan really start to diminish. And then with the sons of God, of course, after that was the flood. When God said, no longer will I even let the sinful wander the earth, but I'm going to take away the actual firmament, the actual ground itself as punishment, in which, of course, nearly the entire race died. And only one family survived. As God's punishment kept widening, trying to guide his children to say, come back to me, you're losing your way. But in each of these times where God's punishment widened, his grace would also deepen. God had promised Adam and Eve, if you eat from this tree, you will die. And they did. But Adam's lifespan was actually far over 900 years. And he had descendant after descendant, so the line of Adam lives on forever. So even though Adam did die, this punishment was delayed for such a long time that God really showed grace on Adam. Or when Cain was cast out of the community and had to wander the earth, the scripture tells us that God put a mark of protection on Cain. That even though he was punished, he would be protected by this mark so that others would know not to harm him. It was a point of grace that God really had on his life. And for Lamech and the sons of God, after the flood, of course, God chose not to wipe out the entire race. But in his grace, he allowed the human race to continue on through the family of Noah. You're with me, right? You got that much? We got our four threads: punishment, but grace always widening along with punishment. And that brings us up to the floods. 2 by 2, rains, floods, boat. Okay? Mankind is rebooted. The only way to get rid of a virus, reformat. And that's what God did. He said, we're going to start from the beginning. We're going to have one family. It's going to be like a new Adam. And we're going to just start this whole thing over. So they did. Noah came out with his family out of their ark, and they were the only family on the earth. And we see some parallels between Adam and Noah. For example, they both had this kind of Genesis moment of being the first man on the earth, and both experienced the earth as kind of being fresh and new. Nearly every scholar who studies the flood will tell you that the earth was fundamentally changed for good after a flood like that. It was no longer the same place. Different type of plants and animals likely flourished that hadn't before, and vice versa. And Adam and Noah really experienced this in a new way. But they didn't only share positive traits. Listen to this quick story about Noah. It's from Genesis chapter 9, something that happened to him when he came out of the ark, beginning in verse 20. It says, Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. You see, it's clear that Noah and Adam, they shared other things in common too. They had this sinful moment where they were naked and someone had to cover them. They had 3 sons, one of which turned against the family and betrayed it and was later cursed. They both experienced the height of God's pleasure and the closest that he had in their life, and the depths of sin that separated them from God. See, even though we rebooted with the flood, all of the same sin is immediately starting over. And it starts to really reach its height in this period at the Tower of Babel. And so I want you, if you would, to take a Bible and actually turn to this passage in the Tower of Babel. If you have your chronological Bible with you, that's awesome. Some people have asked if you should bring them. I say sure. I don't know about you, but I love to take notes in the edge of my Bible. This way you can take notes while you're reading. You can take notes while we're discussing in the services. And you'll kind of always have this 2011 Bible that have all these great notes in it. So by Sanctuary Bible, we mean the one that's always here. Chronological Bible is the one you may or may not have yet, that's from the Resource Center. And we're going to read this account of the Tower of Babel. It's Genesis 11. It's the height of the spread of this period. Okay, beginning of verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That's why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. In this period, we can immediately go back to our 4 threads. First thread, right, the expanding of the human race itself. We see that mankind is doing pretty well at this, actually. The chapter just before the Tower of Babel, Genesis 10, is a passage that people call the Table of Nations. It's the genealogy, the descendants of the 3 sons of Noah. And already at this time, there are 70 nations that are identified. 70. So we don't have a population estimate in terms of numbers, but we see 70 different nations emerging. So you can imagine a group of people would have to reach kind of a certain size to consider themselves a nation, and there are 70 of them. And all 3 of these lines end, and they're not real long, they don't cover a lot of generations, but all of them end with some sort of a statement about a language or a scattering or a dividing of the earth. All things that happened at and as a result of the Tower of Babel incident. So it's clear that this is all around the same time. So man is spreading out again. We have 70 nations listed. But, again, it's the darkening of human sin. Now, some of this doesn't seem so heinous on the surface, but as you start to unpack it, you realize it's the ever-expanding nature of human sin. There's a few things that people really did wrong that were sinful in the eyes of God. One of them is they had been charged with spreading out and populating the earth. But the text tells us that the people together were moving east. They hadn't actually split up at all. They had stayed together as one people group, even though they were growing, and they were all staying together, and they all went together to this same plane. God had told them to spread out, but they didn't. In fact, what did this group of people who stayed together do? Well, they decided to build something very, very tall. Why would they build something very, very tall? What did they just experience? Flooding, right? So if you experience flooding, wouldn't you set out to build something very, very tall? It makes sense to me perfectly. This summer we were on a road trip. We stopped in to see Hilton Head, which is a beautiful place. And like all the houses there are on stilts. You know, the ocean can just wash right over the whole island and everyone would be fine. Like, you know, their jet ski would get a bath and that's it. Like it'd be no problem. So, because they have flooding there. And this is, I believe it's the same type of idea that these people said, hey, what do you say we stay together and we build something tall? I think they were seeking security apart from God. God had made a covenant with Noah that he wasn't going to flood the earth again, but the people said, that was rough. We don't want that again. Let's stay together. Let's have security. Let's build this tower, which is going to reach to the heavens. Metaphorically speaking, they didn't literally believe they were going to climb their tower to be with God. But they're going to build this tower. They stayed together. And then also they sought to make a name for themselves. And that's pretty clear. That instead of seeking to be a people who honored God and were humble to him, instead they sought to make a name for themselves. They said, we will be known for having built this tower. Now, I know that, changing names is pretty common in the Bible. It's usually God who does it. Changing names isn't so unusual. In fact, in our day and age, a lot of people change their names. You might be familiar with some of these names. Who was Marion Morrison? Does anybody know? Marion Morrison, who was that? It's John Wayne, exactly. Now, would you be scared of Marion Morrison if he was on a horse? If your name is Marion, I apologize. Anybody heard of Ralph Lipschitz? That's Ralph Lauren. Well, would you really want to wear that on your pocketbook? Right? Robert Zimmerman, one of the greatest lyricists of all time. Bob Dylan, exactly, very good. Or sometimes companies do this. There was a company that had a product once called Brad's Drink. Anybody ever drank Brad's Drink? It's actually one of my favorites because it's now called Pepsi. That makes a lot more sense. The Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation. Anybody have their TV? Sony, that's right. That's right, Joni. It's Sony. Very good. Or what about, did any of you use Backrub this morning? My whole phone is actually run by Backrub. I don't know about you. Cool. Well, now Backrub is called Google. But it used to be called Backrub. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't really want an operating system called Backrub. Actually, my phone vibrates. There could be something there. I don't know. But, these name changes are not so uncommon, and they're often very useful. They might serve you better. Maybe if you got married, you changed your name to show new unity with your husband. These are all great things. This is not what's happening here at the Tower of Babel incident, which is really a whole city complex. By seeking to make a name for themselves, they're actually declining to be called by the name of God. They're rejecting the name that's been given to them and instead choosing to go their own way. To choose to make your own name is to deny the name and the call that God has put on your life. So in our third thread, then, we see that God now is going to have to widen his punishment on humanity. So the punishments we've seen so far: cast out of the garden, no longer will you eat of God's trees, you have to farm your own food. Now Cain, you can't even farm, you have to just wander the earth. After that, you're going to have a much shorter life. After that, I'm going to take away the very earth itself, and all that's left is humanity. And now at the Tower of Babel, God says, no longer will humanity be unified. The one thing that's remained constant, that humanity has always existed, you will no longer be unified. And I find it interesting, as we continue reading through the Bible in a year, you'll find that very soon we're going to talk about war after war after war after war. And there haven't been any up until this point. Now, I'm sure there were conflicts, I'm sure there were issues, we have records of murder, sure, but there's no warfare. And after this, there will be. And that disunity is part of God's punishment. In fact, that's even part of the language issue that many of us experience even today. I mean, there's a feeling that often comes over anyone, that when people around you are speaking a language you cannot understand, it makes you apprehensive, right? Maybe you're in a foreign country, you can't read the signs, although their signs usually make more sense than ours, actually. But, or you can't understand their mass transit. You can't understand what the nail ladies are saying. I mean, whatever it is, you don't know what they're saying, and it just gives you apprehension. You say, what's happening? And I believe that's an echo of this punishment from God, that there's this disunity now that comes over mankind that never actually leaves. In fact, in the New Testament, when we get there in October, the day of Pentecost is when, for the first time, men of different languages can fully understand each other. Just a little harbinger of heaven someday, when that disunity will be removed and everyone can communicate with each other once again. And then God says he's going to divide them. And there's kind of an interesting thing here. And when I read it, it's hit me every time I've read it, actually. I had a couple of people ask me the same question this week, so I want to go right after it. It says in 11:6, the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So is God afraid of man? Is he worried about what might happen? It almost sounds similar to Genesis 3, where the Lord said, man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and to eat and live forever. Is God a little bit, is he concerned? Saying if man is this united, that they're going to actually ultimately be able to stand up to him? No. That is not God's concern. His concern about man's unified strength was about the pride that would take place in their and our hearts. That if they accomplished this thing that made them feel so full of themselves that they would forever separate themselves from God. See, if he was just worried about this threat, God would have come down and toppled the tower. End of story. Let him build it again, he'll knock it down again. And every time one of these little so-called threats emerged, God would have just wiped it out, taken care of it. Wouldn't have been a problem. But God isn't worried about what man might actually accomplish. He's worried about the pride that would take root in their hearts. See, even this passage where it's kind of unpacking this comment from God, there's even a little bit of humor, and I think even sarcasm there. Listen to the way it's translated in another version, the ESV. Genesis, it's in chapter 11, verse 5. It says, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. Remember, this tower was supposed to reach the heavens. So he's saying, well, so that's nice. So God came down, way down, See this tower that the kids had built. That's really the sentiment here. It's just like in Psalm 2, it has the same kind of sarcasm. It says, "Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, rulers band together against the Lord and his anointed. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them." God is not at all concerned about what they might accomplish. He's only worried about this pride which can take place in their heart and never, ever leave. Charles Towns said it this way: "It's like a beaver telling a rabbit as they stare at the immense wall of the Hoover Dam, 'I didn't build it myself, but the whole thing was my idea.'" It's the same feeling, saying, "Well, God, we're going to make a tower and we're going to rival you." It doesn't actually make any sense. But these people, they sought to make a name for themselves, and that they did. Because Babylon, which is the same word as Babel, it literally means the gateway to God. But that's not really how we know it anymore, because it sounds almost exactly like the word for babbling, like a baby would do. But fine, you want to make a name for yourself? We can do that. You will now be known forever as the people who babbled like idiots. That's the name that they made for themselves, because so often when we seek ourselves, when we seek pride, that's exactly what happens. Now, what can we take away from all this history? Okay, we're not studying the Bible as a history lesson. We're not taking a quiz and then a test. This is actually written to teach God's people how to live and to teach the world the love that God has for them. So what can we really take and live and learn from this? It's all centered on this issue of pride. Every one of these sins that we've come across have been a deepening of the human sin of pride. That as man darkens and looks inward instead of upward, we become more and more concerned with self, more and more wrapped up in what we can do. Listen to these verses from Proverbs and from James. It says in Proverbs 29, "Pride brings a person low, but the lowly in spirit gain honor." Or in James, "God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble." Active opposition to the proud. I don't know about you, but that's a group I would never want to be in. A group that's identified as those whom God opposes. That's scary stuff. But to live in pride is to live in rebellion towards God. And to continue to turn our own way is to turn away from Him. Now, humility doesn't mean that you just think less of yourself. Doesn't mean that you kind of think down on yourself. In fact, some people who have a very low self-image or a very low sense of self-worth, you can actually still be very prideful in that position, because that really means that you're just sitting around all day still thinking about yourself, actually. So humility is really the sense of just not thinking about yourself as often, of putting others before yourself, of putting their needs, their wants, their desires ahead of yours, seeking to bring God's grace to them on earth as it is in heaven, seeking to minister in God's name, doing and loving and giving to people as you know that God would have you to do. That's the sense and the takeaway that we can take from all of this. But what about our fourth thread? The deepening of God's grace. See, in every other instance along our timeline here, the grace has been immediate, and it's been nearly obvious. Cain, you have to wander the earth, I'll protect you with a mark. But here, it's not. The people are scattered, the world is divided, and it seems as though a new story begins. Because the very next story in the Bible is the account of Abraham. But it's directly tied to the sin of Babel. Trevor already read it this morning, but listen again. Genesis 12, verse 2. God says to Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all people on earth will be blessed through you." God is telling Abraham, we're going to have to come at this in a completely different way. I'm going to raise up from the divided earth a people to myself. But it goes even beyond that, because when God is talking about being all people on earth being blessed through you, this is actually a promise that Jesus is coming. It's a promise that Messiah will come, that the one who can actually take our sin upon him so that we can be fully forgiven is coming. That the one who never has to make a name for himself because he fully assumes the name that the Father gives him as part of the triune God, he will come, he will be given on earth so that we can live that in eternity with him, that we can be forgiven of these sins of pride and of arrogance and instead turn to God through Christ. And this is the promise given to Abraham. This is our fourth thread, the thread of God's deepening grace to know that Jesus will be sent, Jesus who will come from the line of Abraham to forgive us of our sins. So why don't we pray together? God in heaven, your word is so rich. There's depth and there's a fullness, God, that we just begin to understand in so many ways. And I thank you that you've revealed to us more about who you are, about your character. And I pray, God, that we would learn to live every day as people who are humble, as people who remember how you've been faithful to us, who notice your grace and who live in the light of it. So God, be with us now and always. Help us to live today and every day in just the life that you've called us to. In Jesus' name, amen.